It's not live. It's I'm shocked that that's even on or not.
That's exactly right. I thought that not saying, yeah, you said it would rain.
But being said, watch my car. That's the key. That helps.
I think
yeah. Welcome. Where y'all going? And then we went to
Josh, you give me a thumbs up. Can you hear me from here?
Yes.
Just like the ring.
Okay, good morning. It looks like it is 9:30, so we do not want to delay. I think folks are still wandering in from out the hallway there, but please do make your way by the refreshment table this morning. We have some good stuff there. Thanks again to Deb Schneider and this morning Karen Caldell, who have provided us with our refreshments today. So it's good to be back for this fourth out of 5 Pellett-Wearn lectures, and to welcome Professor Joshua Morris by Zoom from Charlotte, from his home in Charlotte. Home or office, I'm a home office or seminary office, not sure which one you're calling from today, Josh, but good to have you with us. If we could open this time with a prayer, let us pray. God of the covenant, you are always faithful to your people, but we are not always faithful to one another. The trauma of your people does not always come from the outside, from Egypt or Babylon or Rome or America, but too often from inside the family of faith, one sibling against another, one disciple against another, one member of the body of Christ against another. By your holy word, humble us to acknowledge how we have broken faith and fellowship. And by your Holy Spirit, heal us that we may embody your shalom. Speak to us once more today, O God, through our teacher, Professor Joshua Morris, through his lived experience, his careful study, his words prepared for us and for you today. We thank you for Josh and for this time together. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Josh, welcome back to Portland.
Thank you. Good to see you all. I'm in my Charlotte office though, with loud children. It would be maybe a little more off-putting than if I was here. So I came into the office today, but it's good to see you all, and I look forward to being with you again in person next Sunday as we wrap things up. And so this has been a really meaningful time for me. It's been great to meet a lot of you and hear your stories and hear how this material is impacting you or has impacted you. And so today, as we move, I want to name something up top that we've been you sort of naming the past 4 weeks, but like that these experiences that we talk about are not abstract theories. That for many of you, it hits you directly. Maybe your own story or a family member's story, a neighbor's story. And so when we talk about providing care, like we recognize that giving, receiving care, it stirs our deepest feelings. So yes, we're talking about like how do we become a trauma-informed church? How do we do this work? What does religious trauma tell us about the church? But I also want us to be aware that like as a community, what we've been doing these 4 weeks is trying to recognize that this is real and this is human. And so sometimes that's evident maybe to one person in the room. And so we want to care for one another as we talk about these lectures. That's always really important to me is that we're teaching about trauma, but let's teach about it in a trauma-informed way. So as we move, we're moving quickly. I feel like this has been going really quick. So today is when the church is traumatizing. So talking about religious trauma and I was talking to Jackie beforehand, and I was just saying, like you should be teaching this. Like you should be teaching me about this. The work your church is doing to be a space for people who have gone through religious trauma, have been traumatized by the church or by religious communities, in being a safer space to talk about that stuff is really beautiful. And so I'm really humbled and honored to like try to speak something into a community that's already doing that. So thank you. I mentioned something in week one, and I just keep thinking about Lent and the idea of talking about trauma through Lent. And that for us, like our faith, the work of our faith, like what we represent as Christians is a response to trauma. That as we get closer to Passion Week, that the betrayal, the brutalization, the crucifixion of Jesus, and then that life rupturing news that that same Jesus that died rose again. Like we speak out of that, we speak from that. And so understanding trauma is not just like a peripheral interest. It isn't just a thing that we're sort of interested in, but this is a primary starting point for us. This is a part of our narrative, it's a part of our story, who we are as a people. And so what today's focus is what about those traumas? What about those moral injuries that come from the church? But as we've been doing, we're going to do another centering exercise. This one is called PAN, P-A-N, pay attention now. So this is a mindfulness exercise, helps bring awareness to our thoughts, to our feelings, to our emotions. And when we bring those awarenesses up, we do that without judgment. The hope in all these things is to find calm, reduce stress, work to center us. Now, when you do this on your own, maybe this could be, 7 to 10 minutes, but today we'll just do it for about a minute just to kind of work through it together. So, as we've been doing, I encourage you to sit comfortably, whatever is comfortable for you, your feet under you, feel the chair that's supporting you. If you feel comfortable and safe to close your eyes or fix your gaze in front of you, and just take a couple of deep breaths like we did last week. The first thing in this exercise of paying attention now is to bring awareness to what's going on in your head. Where are you this morning? What's happening in your thoughts? Maybe you feel scattered. Maybe you're thinking about your grocery list. But don't judge it, just notice it. Next, I invite you to bring awareness to what's going on in your body. How are you feeling this morning? Are you feeling light? Are you feeling tense in certain places? Do you sense any discomfort that wasn't there yesterday? Some tension that maybe wasn't there yesterday? I feel mine in my neck today. Once again, there's no need to judge or to fix what you feel. Just pay attention to your body. Finally, bring awareness to what's going on in your emotions. How are you feeling? What emotions are surfacing for you? Are you stressed, excited, overwhelmed? Remember, there's no judgment. We're just paying attention to how you are feeling in the moment. Now take a few more deep breaths. And when you're ready, I invite you to come back to the room. I'm going to start with two quotes. These two quotes are from this book, Trauma-Informed Pastoral Care by psychologist and pastoral care provider Karen McClintock. So Karen says that in multiple studies, religion is shown to benefit overall mental health, except when it's overly simplistic, dogmatic, and shame-inducing. And we could probably talk for the rest of the morning or a whole 5-week lecture series on what we mean by overly simplistic, dogmatic, and shame-inducing. Maybe there's some messages you've heard throughout your life that feel overly simplistic. Maybe you had a hospital visit and you were told that this was God's will, this is God's plan. These things that feel just incredibly simplistic, they make you feel guilty for even thinking those things. So what I keep thinking about when I've thought of this lecture series is, yes, our churches are resources for responding to trauma. And as I brag about you all, like you all are doing this. You all are spaces that are responding to religious trauma. And unfortunately, we know that sometimes these are the very same spaces that cause trauma. So yesterday I was wrapping up a class I'm teaching, which is called Trauma-Informed Pastoral Care. This is my entire life right now. But my seminary students, like their presentations over and over again are about being in the church, providing care, what we can do to support the church community that's trying to move forward and understand the traumas and the harms. And they're focusing on that we so often that we want faith to be a resource. We want it to be a thing that improves resilience, but spiritual abuse can turn God into a perceived perpetrator of harm. So our theological reflection, the things we've been doing as a community here for 4 weeks, and we'll finish up next week, is to acknowledge trauma's impact on our communities. So as I said in week 1, we can assume with almost 100% clarity that trauma exists in every faith community, even if no one's going to mention it. And that assumption, I think, it acknowledges that the reality of trauma, we name it so survivors know that they're not alone in their pain, that they have a space that is at least open and honest enough to name it. And that leads to this next quote. So Karen says that faith communities can be powerful places of solace and healing. In small groups, where faith questions are viewed as healthy and spiritually enlightening, victims feel safe and mending begins. I love that. That these things start small, right? And I know that even in your own spaces, that things have started small and they've built and they've built. It's like if you build it, they will come. It feels like a field of dreams analogy here. But I highlighted the word safe because as we remember that for any recovery, any healing from trauma, that ozone of safety, that bedrock, you need safety in order to build towards healing. And so what I want to do to kind of continue to set the stage for how serious religious trauma is kind of talk about these 3 different types of traumas. And so we've spent most of our time talking about direct traumas. Like what becomes the categories for things in the DSM, like wars, natural disasters, car accidents, shootings, right? Those things that like we can point to and say that this event happened outside of me, happened to my community. And then another form of trauma or type is indirect. If you think back to 2016, like the Pulse nightclub shooting, that the LGBTQ community, not just in Orlando, but throughout the world, experiences traumatization through another's impact, right? That it's like my community was attacked in Orlando, but here I am in Seattle, and that feels like an attack on me. And that is also a normal response to trauma. That when certain communities are targeted, even though it wasn't directly targeted to you as like as an individual, but it was indirectly to your community. And then we'll spend the bulk of the our time this morning are these insidious traumas. And what these do is these shape the entire worldview of the victim or of the survivor. That safety, survival, security are not a guarantee. That you go back into the church the next Sunday and that has been the site of your trauma. And so there are these daily, weekly incidents of marginalization, dehumanization, intimidation experienced by a group. And the main groups we'll talk about today of how religious trauma shows up is through clergy abuse, the traumas done to LGBTQ community, women in ministry, like these communities that have been targeted by racism, heterosexism, ableism, and sexism. Like these traumas are done in the church in an insidious way. It's hard to say. So once again, safety, number one, that it's not that trauma is cyclical. I'm going to say this every week because I think it's incredibly important to remember that it's not linear, that we may move through these things. We may think, I feel safe now. Now I can start to make meaning. I'm telling my story. I feel like I'm starting to reconnect, but then something will happen that'll rupture that safety. You feel like you go back to step one. And it may feel that way. It may feel like all that progress you made is not progress at all. But my encouragement to people is no, you have that resilience you've been building up, and we establish safety again, and we continue to move because the work is about integrating trauma. So, spiritual safety. So, building on that idea that the number one thing we need is safety, is that we need safety to be confident in one's beliefs and have the safety to question. So many of our students who come to Union, like they have a faculty interview where we get to meet them. And over again, I'm blown away by the amount of times the stories I hear are, I want to come back to church. I want to come back to these spaces because I want to do it differently than how I was raised. Most recently, I was talking to a prospective student who was saying, I was told by the church that there was no place for a woman to be in ministry, that I could volunteer, but I'm too tall. My voice is too much like this. I'm too bossy. I'm too X, Y, and Z. That who I am in my very personhood, I'm not safe here. And so when people feel spiritually safe, they know in their core, like in their personhood, in like the very essence of who they are, that it's okay to both express and explore their beliefs and values, and that there's no retribution for doing so. And it also means like not only is that safety there for the people, but that's what's been curated by the leaders. That these spaces, these communities, the structures can hold that. It can contain the doubt. It can contain like different perspectives on issues. And I'm not here to point any fingers at any religious community. That's not really the point. But I think we do know examples of authoritarian religious communities where the pastor is almost as inerrant as the Bible that they profess. And so if you hold different views from the status quo, you're shut down. Maybe you're even cast out from that community. And when that community feels like your family, feels like your friends, like this is not a spiritually safe environment. I shared this stat with you in week one. I've continued to think about it all month. 33% or one third of US adults, like we know these people. These are our beloved neighbors. These are our sisters, our brothers, our siblings. Maybe it's you, maybe it's me. So yes, it's a statistic, but behind that statistic are people trying to make sense of what the church has done and what it might look like to move through that. And so we'll talk a lot about moral injury again today, as we built last week, of how these betrayals that take place in the church have a similar impact as the moral injury we talked about from combat or from healthcare and those things last week. And so in 2011, Marlene Winnell, who's a psychologist, she coined the term religious trauma syndrome, excuse me. And so what she was talking about is that these doctrines that have been taught to you over and over, whether that's in sermons, small groups, Bible studies, church luncheons, lock-ins, etc., they've been so damaging, so insidious, right, to bring that word back up, that you can't even separate it. It's part and parcel to the entire religious experience. And so in many cases, these individuals have been violated and traumatized and abused. They've been shamed, and that impact is deep. It is everlasting, makes them question God overall. It's not just the pastor of this church in this city, but it goes all the way to the top, so to speak. So it's not just the church, it's not just Christianity, but it's this whole moral fabric of the culture that's been passed down through generation to generation. Like that's what we're up against. And that's why it's so important to talk about this. So the first example that I'm going to talk about is clergy sex abuse, just as a way to think about moral injury and trauma and religious trauma. So it arises from an ecclesial culture marked by clericalism, that the pastor can do no wrong, right? Hierarchicalism, like who are you to question this institution, and a deep hegemonic masculinity that leave women and children especially unsafe. This has been described in interview after interview as like a murder of our soul, that the place we go to feel cared for, nurtured, sustained is the place that is the site of the trauma. So last week I left and I said that moral injury has these three things going on: a betrayal of what's morally right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. And so in moral injury research, we talk a lot about a benevolent moral authority, that when we like think about treatment and healing and recovery, that there's this benevolent moral authority that we want to talk to, that we want to process with, that we want to hold accountable. But what happens if that figure is the pastor, is the priest, is the chaplain, is the abuser? Are we saying that ultimately this authority figure is acting with God? So this goes to our idea of power, the power of unchecked privilege in institutions. And what people do is they internalize these things. They say, well, there must be something wrong with me. It's not the church's fault. There must be something internally wrong with me, that I am beyond redemption, that these things are happening to me. And then what we see over and over again is a lack of restitution, a lack of accountability, a lack of redemption. We see deep levels of secrecy, getting new positions where it gets swept under the rug, moved across the country, moved across the world. And that just becomes an additional level of moral injury. So it's not just the church, but it's the culture around the church, right, that imposes silence, stigma, and shame on the survivors. And so the secrecy, because it becomes its own form of death, that you are suffering with this in silence. You are suffering with this on your own. And so these instances of abuse, they kind of do five things to us and more, I'm sure. But this idea of alienation and abandonment, that it affects your self-image. That murder of the soul thing I mentioned a couple of slides ago, that this moral injury, it affects their self-image. Like in response to a traumatic event, the perpetrators, the victims, and the witnesses are all trying to make sense of why this happened. And there's constantly second guessing of how they responded. Why did I let, why did I let this happen to me? Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my son? Why did I let this happen to my daughter? I thought they were safe going to the youth group. Like it impacts all of our decision making. Everything gets like convoluted and cloudy, and we try to make sense of it. And in that sense of trying to make sense of it, it casts deep sense of confusion on our moral perception and our reasoning. So understanding this as a moral injury within trauma is that experiencing such an unexpected abuse of trust shatters how one views oneself, how they view others, and how they even view God. How could God allow this to happen in God's house? So this undercuts one's complete confidence in their own moral compass and judgment, even in the past, in the present, and the future. 3, a sense of diminished agency. So, in light of what the morally injured person has done, has had done to them, or observed, it's so incredibly difficult to avoid those responses we talked about in week 1. The numbness, the despondency, the dissociation, this pervasive sense of futility. That we struggle to cope, we struggle to come back because of these acts that happen in churches. For the damage done to our relationships. That broken trust is everywhere. Broken loyalty, and that loyalty is intrapersonal, it's within ourselves, it's interpersonal, it's with our friends in the pews, our small group members, but it's also institutional. That we lose trust in churches, we lose trust in this very, very institution that it used to be a deep side of meaning making. And so survivors of abuse in religious contexts are more prone to have family breakdowns because this violation, it takes away the sense of safety and security and confidence in others. Like it's not just the damage in religious contexts, like that becomes the platform for everything else. And then of course, a torn moral fabric questions the credibility of the church. Like the revelations of clergy sex abuse, for example, have caused millions of people to leave the church or feel like the church left them, might be the better way to say it. These individuals are not wanting to be associated with the grotesque behaviors of these individuals, these people who are viewed as enablers, who helped, who hid, who worked in secrecy to reassign these people. So then moral injury is a symptom of poor mental health in the church as an institution, as a community, and as a culture. So it's been a heavy couple of slides. And I want us to think about healing and what trauma-informed care looks like. And to confront moral injury in the church, to confront religious trauma in the church, we need to continue to be a moral witness that all members of the body of Christ, all of us, that we deserve and will have made available to them pathways to heal together. And so Bell Hooks says that rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. So once again, to brag about you all, like this is what you're doing, like to create a space where people feel that healing is an act of communion. Because a couple of minutes ago, I talked about internalization, that these things, they sit in our souls and we don't want to talk about it. I could never tell anybody this story. Like, I can't believe this happened to me. How could I share this with the church? Then we stay in isolation, we stay internalized. But to be able to move into a community when we feel safe, to hear others boldly and with courage share their own story, like that sets the tempo to be able to share these stories in this, in a sense where healing becomes an act of communion. So that was one. And then I talked about that we would talk about LGBTQ inclusion in the church. So religious trauma occurs when an individual's religious upbringing has lasting adverse effects on their physical, mental, or emotional well-being. And some of those symptoms can be guilt, can be shame, loss of trust, loss of meaning. And this isn't an official classification in the DSM, right? Like we talked about, post-traumatic stress being new in 1980. This is not in there. But there is debate that it should be, and that there should be change, that this should be included. And I just think of these three quotes on the slide. Imagine being told by everyone you trusted that you're going to hell because you like men. The church has been the villain in my life story. Religion has obliterated my life. And that moves me deeply. It convicts me deeply that we want to tell a different story, that we want to create a different space to hold this differently. And as we know, it's not just one church, it's not just one denomination, one religion, but the entire moral fabric of the culture, once again, that's been passed down from generation to generation, causes and has been with this sense of condemnation. And so once again, as I started, these students who come to me and they're thinking about seminary, or they're writing their final projects. It's like, how do we create a space? How can the church be a space for LGBTQ inclusion? How do we create a world of healing when to even come back in the room would have to counter the three quotes that you see on this slide? The pain of being told you're going to hell obliterated my life. And so then I've been thinking, even as we move towards some sense of what does it mean to respond to this? What does it mean to be a space that can hold these things with our parishioners? I think about these faith issues, like the role of relationships, the role of within our formation as Christians, that we think about healing, the healing power of relationships, not just with one another, but ultimately with our relationship with God, with Jesus, and that our identities are shaped as people in relationship. And so I do think it's so normal then that people say, why me? Why did these religious traumas happen to me? Why does this evil persist? And ultimately, why? Why God? And as a care provider, when people are on these quests, as Karen McClintock refers to them as quests, we can feel really uncomfortable and we want to answer that. We want to provide an answer. We want to provide a why. We want to provide a way to think about these things. And my encouragement is to resist. It's to hold the space. It's to listen. It's to normalize and empathize and think with them that what happened to them was not their fault. And we talk about power, we talk about privilege, all those things to be able to share of holding that space with them. But to get those stories out, right? move that internalization into an externalization. So I want to close with 2 slides, and then I want to hear from you all because as I keep saying, you all do this so beautifully. So I want you to teach me. We talked about these 4 R's of trauma-informed care. So thinking about religious trauma and thinking about um, particularly LGBTQ inclusion, or specifically about like incidences of clergy misconduct. We realize these things. We've been talking about it for 35 minutes. We recognize it. And now we get to this place where we want to respond. We want our sermons and our curriculum to be trauma informed. We want to resist re-traumatization. It's like, how do we show up for people in our pews? How do we hold these stories that you all are holding with grace as we hear the harrowing things that have happened to our beloved? Once again, I think it comes from creating supportive environments that prioritize safety through active listening to individuals, respecting their experiences, respecting their feelings, respecting and believing their stories, believing trauma stories, believing victims is more than just a first step. I mean, that is foundational and transformative for individuals. And my question in week 1 was, instead of saying what is wrong with you, it becomes what has happened to you. So when we think about resisting re-traumatization, it's flipping the way we think about trauma, flipping the way we think about what happened to you instead of asking what is wrong with you. Why did this happen to you? And so then I mentioned that there are these 6 principles. I talked a lot today about safety, but I don't think you can say more. You could always say more about safety and trustworthiness and transparency, that we as a congregation, we as a church, that we are going to be a space that holds this with you. And that with as much transparency as we can, that we're going to explain decisions, we're going to explain our stance on things. We're going to talk about this on our website, because that's often in 2025 the main way people find out about churches, right? On social media, on websites. So what are ways we can be transparent about what we represent as a church, as a community, as Fourth Presbyterian or as Union Presbyterian Seminary? How are we a place that holds these conversations? And the last one I want to say before I stop sharing is the one on empowerment, voice, and choice. To be a space that helps people refine their voice. It wasn't that their voice is gone. It's that it's been pushed down, it's been repressed. And so providing the space to slowly bring people back to a sense of voice and choice, of empowerment. Because we as a church, as Lenten people moving towards resurrection, we believe in resurrection. We believe in recovery. We believe in reconciliation and all these beautiful but difficult things to do. We believe in this. We believe this deeply. It has happened to us. It has happened to our families. It's happened to our parishioners. Um, and so since trauma, especially religious trauma, was often involved such a lack of choice, a lack of being able to make decision, your own voice, who you are in your soul that God has created you to be. We want to flip that, to be able to hold with these individuals to say that who you are in your most innermost person is God's beloved. And that's what we believe, and that's what we want to hold with them. And so I'm going to unshare. I am very interested in hearing from you all, your experiences at Fourth and what's been working for you. So thank you.
Thank you, John. I've got a microphone so that we can ask questions or share, and we'll do our best with the internet connection that we have. You mentioned several times about what Fourth is doing to try to be a safe place for people who have experienced various kinds of trauma, and in particular religious trauma. One of those things has been through a refreshing of our vision, our values statement rather, to try to name our desire, our vision of being an inclusive community, a community of welcome for all people. But it's something one way that we're approaching this, I say we, many of us probably are not aware of some of the work that Pastor Jackie has been doing with folks who have experienced specifically religious trauma. And I was wondering if Jackie might share a word or two about that.
So those of you who have known me and heard my sermons over the last 7 years know that I often preach about religious harm and trauma, something that I've experienced in my life. And I started to suspect a couple of years ago that Greenville might be a place where there are more people like me. And so I got about 10 people around a table, people I had met who had experienced religious harm and trauma. And we just began talking about our experiences. This group is what inspired my doctoral work on embodiment. Embodiment is a powerful tool for healing trauma. And so as I began to work through my doctoral program and with this group, I began to discover the need out there for authentic belonging for people who find church inaccessible due to prior experiences of religious harm and trauma, which often comes from high control religious systems. That group has grown and grown and grown, and we have over 70 people now. We do not meet at the church. You might imagine that some of the folks in the group may never step foot in a church again. So we meet at a brewery, and we are busting at the seams of our little free room that Other Lands gets us. And so this work is near and dear to my heart, and I long to find more ways for this congregation to support and encourage the people who are on the periphery of our churches who can't walk into a sanctuary without having a panic attack. That's a very real reality for people who've left high control religious systems. I think you all here in this congregation, we have a theology and a love that is liberating for people. It certainly has been for me. But how can we work together to make that love and liberation accessible for people who aren't going to show up on a Sunday morning? So that's a question that I'm asking, and that's a question that I invite you all to ask alongside of me. And can I ask Dr. Morris a question? I wonder what you might say, Dr. Morris, to someone in my group who says, I long for spiritual connection and community, but I just can't find it in the church. What would you say to that person?
Yeah. First, I would say I'm sorry that what they've gone through, what they've experienced. I would say that they can experience God outside the church as well. I don't know if that's heretical to say. I'm not in a church right now. You all are in a church. I'm at a school, so I can. I would say that finding community and spiritual community exists in beautiful spaces that are not always a church, and to come back to spirituality is a process and it's a journey. So finding people who love you for who you are, maybe that's a brewery that's busting out the seams that you wouldn't even know it's connected to a church, or maybe it's a running group, maybe it's a book club, but there are ways to re-experience mystery and re-experience the divine in ways that maybe don't feel as formal as what you're used to. Maybe it's a completely different religious community if you feel ready for that. But I would say my point is not to feel limited, that you can only experience God or mystery or the divine inside of a church.
Thank you, and I guess our definition of in the church might need to broaden a little bit to not just mean the walls here and not just mean the membership here, but wherever people gather in the spirit of love of Christ. And also interesting, you said a couple times, high control religious system, is that what you said? Social control, I take that as meaning this is how you must live your life, or we shame you, or worse. Okay, other questions that we have for Dr. Morris or each other? Or thoughts? It's a lot of process, I know.
I was wondering how you identify and find those people. I don't know how you did, Master Jackson, but I was curious about how membership here would help find, find people in order to reach out to.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I have not advertised decon recon, that's what we call ourselves, deconstruction, reconstruction. I have not advertised that group, because we're still looking for how we can grow while being in our limited space and with our limited resources. The resource right here. But so a lot of this started, again, it was 10 people initially, and then all of them started saying, my friend so-and-so, or my friend so-and-so. So it's all been word of mouth at this point. I wonder what we could do if we got the word out in other avenues. I think social media is a really powerful tool. But I will also acknowledge, and this is part of, I think, religious harm and trauma, is that there is a part of me that is afraid of being a face and name associated with a group like this. The people who show up in this decon recon group often are putting a lot at risk professionally, in their family systems, in their church systems. There are some people who, if their employer knew that they were meeting with a group like us, which by the way, over half of my group, I'd say 2/3 of my group is LGBTQ. And so there is a degree of risk that comes with putting your name and face to a movement like this. And yeah, I'm a little scared. So that's where we're at.
Great question. And folks that have been harmed in some way, and there's a variety of ways, by organized religion. Once you begin to organize your group, it starts to feel like organized religion. So there's another challenge there. Other questions or thoughts? Yes.
How do we break the equation that church equals spiritual community? Because that equation, to me, needs to be broken, that church is not the only spiritual community. The only spiritual community is not the church.
Mhm.
I mean, I've been influenced by Ray Oldenburg's book, The Great Good Place, and it sits in third place in our lives. So how do we deal with understanding the separation between the church and a religious community or spiritual community? They're not the same thing. Are they?
The difference between, you might not have heard that at first because I hadn't given it the microphone, but how do we break the equation of the church equals spiritual community? That they're not necessarily the same thing. I think to me, it's like a Venn diagram, right? There's overlap between the church and our spiritual community, but there might, as Dr. Morris was saying, there might be members of our spiritual community outside the church as well.
And I also wonder, I don't want to interrupt anybody on my left who might be wanting to talk. Sorry. The idea like we don't really get community in a lot of places anymore. I mean, Bowling Alone showed this, and just The Anxious Generation from Jonathan Haidt shows this, that like we don't get community in many places like we used to. And so I I think your point is valid, and I wonder about trying to be more communal in all our spaces. I don't know. I don't really have a better answer than that, but I think your point is apt, and it's important to raise that we don't have a lot of community. At least I don't. Like I'll speak for myself. Like I don't have a lot of community in my own life, and things can feel very isolating um, as a young parent or a younger parent.
Okay, maybe one last question here before we wrap it up.
you know, 4 different faiths, and coming here, learning about grace, has been very positive. So I think
Hmm.
positive in tragedy as well. If you've been 4 different faiths, you know you've had tragedy.
For faith, for different traditions.
Yeah, I hear that. Thanks for sharing that. Like I was raised Roman Catholic. I went to Catholic school till 8th grade, and then my parents decided we were going to be Southern Baptists. That didn't work for me. And then I became so here I am now as a UCC pastor at a Presbyterian seminary. So I have grace for all of my own story. Yeah, can I say one more thing and then I'll stop talking? I just want to like highlight this slide again. Like thinking about what Pastor Jackie just said, like in small groups, she said this thing started with 10 and now they're busting out the seams at 70. So like these things build where people feel safe and you still have to maintain safety and thinking about jobs and how risky it is even to claim your identity. So I just want to say like I'm blown away by that number. Just amen. That's beautiful. Um, and bless you all in the rest of your Sunday.
Well, thank you, Josh, for being with us again this morning. We look forward to having you here in person next week
Yes.
for the final lecture. So
You too.
thanks
Thank you.
everyone for gathering. We'll see you in the sanctuary.